the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we begin today's discussion, we want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We have made the Discord server available to patrons, and Taylor's running some reading groups there. He's been recording the audio for those on some of the works he's translated. So we've had a pretty good showing for those. That content's available. We're going to continue to do those on probably like a bi-weekly cadence. So don't feel bad if you're behind. You can always go back and listen to some of the earlier content. However, today's episode, we'll be diving into the work of Jean Laplanche, specifically The Temptation of Biology, Freud's Theories of Sexuality.
Laplanche, I think I've told you he's one of my favorite analysts. We've covered Life and Death in Psychoanalysis. That was one of his first books, besides his dissertation on Holderlin and The Name of the Father. Yeah, but Life and Death in Psychoanalysis was the first one translated. And he does refer back to that book and his views have evolved. But we've talked a little bit about Laplanche here and there outside of that book. And, you know, the main thing being, I guess what I would start off with, because I do think it's important, is his view that Freud's early theory of seduction has a kernel of truth. And I think that that's one of the guiding threads throughout Laplanche's work, that he's trying to, if you will, take Freud's seduction theory, revise it, generalize it, and universalize it. And what all that means is, first, we need to talk a little bit, just for a moment, about Freud's early seduction theory, which may or may not be well known to listeners. And then we could suggest what Laplanche is pointing to, and that might orient our discussion.
Yeah.
So, you know, up until 1897, so let's say for about a decade or so, right between, I don't know, Freud's earliest writings in the 1880s, and perhaps these ideas were already percolating, right? But let's just say from 1885 to 1895, Laplanche dates it at 1897. I think he's thinking of a particular date. He's probably thinking of one of the letters to Fleece, where Freud is giving up on what he calls his neurotica, which Laplanche takes to be the seduction theory. So roughly 1895, 1897 is when Freud gives up on the seduction theory. So for Freud, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, Freud was always concerned with finding a point in, let's call it reality, quote unquote, right? Scare quotes, reality, where traumatic events would determine a sort of trajectory, a path for the psychical development of the human being, right? So literally, he takes seduction very literally, in that any sort of pathological development in the unconscious, right, in the psyche, would be based on a real event that happened. Specifically for Freud, because he emphasizes childhood sexuality, he's thinking that some molestation, rape, some sort of traumatic sexual event happened in the pathological individual's childhood, specifically by an adult. For Freud, the general case would be one of the caregivers or their substitutes. So a mother, a father, or their substitutes, like a nurse. We see this right in like the Wolfman and the Rat Man. This why Freud puts so much attention to nurses, even after he's already abandoned the seduction theory by that point. He still put some emphasis on it. But I think that for Laplanche, Freud is not understanding the fantasy element, which Freud pretty much kind of admits later, even if he still vacillates on this. And this is a kind of this is part of the spiraling that Laplanche talks about, the goings astray. But in any case, Freud realizes that this literal seduction theory, that all pathology is based in a real, quote unquote, actual traumatic event that happened in childhood, can't actually explain all of every individual's pathological states. That on the one hand, there's an argument by numbers that it would be too prevalent. And on the other hand, he realizes that fantasy and confabulation, or the retrospective sort of projecting back into childhood of things that only come up later, that there's an element of fantasy that's temporally projected back into childhood that can't necessarily be located in a physical event that would have taken place. Obviously, this is not to say that sexual abuse doesn't happen, or even that it happens more than we would like to admit, but that I think for Freud, he realizes it can't be the basis or even the sole basis for traumatic or for pathological development. Laplanche says actually Freud's actually onto something here with the seduction theory, but it's because he takes it too literally, right? He takes it in a sense that is restrictive to quote unquote actual events. Deleuze might say he doesn't see the virtual dimension, right? Although Laplanche doesn't use that language. But Laplanche says, no, actually, there is always an element because of the child's helplessness, right? Because of our mammalian development, and we are helpless to care for ourselves, unlike certain other animal species, that may not need as much caregiving by parents or adults of the species. Because of this state of helplessness, we are always sort of reliant upon a caregiver, which includes not just the giving of tenderness, love, and sustenance, right? The mother's milk being the primary example, but also some sort of protection, right? Some sort of providing of protection, which is generally, there's a kind of division of sexual labor there, where the mother is supposedly feeding and the father is supposedly protecting, although these are by no means obviously gendered aspects. It's just a kind of stereotype, if you will, that Freud runs with as an expedient. But in any case, I think that for Laplanche, he realizes that it's in fact the adult caregiving and protection of the child. There is always an element unconsciously transmitted as a enigmatic message, or he'll call it a signifier or a bundle of signifiers, that imbues in the young child what will become the development of their unconscious, right? Their psychical apparatus. And so I think for Laplanche, he's trying to suggest, no, seduction is actually the right model to take. It's just that we have to really completely reorient what we mean by seduction, because now it's no longer the case of a violence done to the child consciously by means of rape, molestation, etc. But it's an inevitable process in sort of all development. Whereas, we're not just thrown into the world without any sort of, as though we were, completely self-sufficient beings. If that were possible, then maybe we could forego the notion of seduction. We always rely on adult others to care for us, to protect us, but also to train us, right? Like in the anal stage of being able to control our bowels, etc. So this is kind of maybe a very brief and broad frame for what Laplanche is interested in with sort of, I think it's important, universalizing but generalizing seduction, right? So now it's whether or not there are pathological developments, right? Whether or not we develop the sort of symptoms of neurosis, etc. Whether or not there is something that psychoanalysis would locate in hysteria or obsessive compulsion or whatnot, doesn't matter, right? Even quote unquote normal individuals would go through seduction, which obviously violates what Freud was looking at in those years from 1880 something to 1897, where he thinks it's only this pathological individuals are it's a product of adult rape, molestation, sexual abuse. For Laplanche, no. In fact, there doesn't have to be any abuse at all involved. There is always a transmission of sexuality from the adult to the child, which is why I think Laplanche wants to say Freud is vacillating on this question of childhood sexuality, because he's trying to struggle with the fact that sexuality would somehow be inherent or embedded in the species or the biology of the individual. Whereas I think for Laplanche, it has to come from the other. It has to come from the adult. And it's that type of interplay that I think is what Laplanche is interested in looking back at these terms like the theory of propping or leaning on. But I'll stop there just so we can maybe like reorient around this little framework.
Yeah, I think one of the first thoughts I had about this was, I guess the seduction idea in particular was, I believe it's Deleuze and Guattari that say or talk about Oedipus beginning in the mind of the father. Am I right?
Yes, they do say
okay,
this.
So yeah, I thought this was an interesting connection here relative to the seduction theory. There, another connection with Deleuze and Guattari. It's kind of interesting too. Like Laplanche has this kind of like liminal space in between, kind of like a Lacanian theory and Deleuze and Guattari. Like he moves in the direction of a more, let's say, deterritorialized sexuality than even Lacan, but not quite to the extent that Deleuze and Guattari do. We didn't really mention, you mentioned surprisingly, one of your favorite terms, polymorphous perversity, or maybe I'm just
the
cobwebs out.
That's a great term, and we can talk about it. But go ahead.
Because I guess I would sort of even maybe want to push back, not aggressively, but like a little bit, because one of the big things that Laplanche is doing here is trying to argue against this kind of like biological materialist imperative for desire, and I guess specifically like libido in the more straight up sexual means that, I guess like in the context of individuation, I mean, I don't know that I would necessarily want to say that sexual development follows like these, or like the sort of organ trajectory of desire that Freud goes through with the different stages, anal, oral, etc. But it does seem to like, it's interesting, like this idea of like differentiation, where, I mean, even really what I wanted to say was, the polymorphous perversity thing is kind of like a body without organs, because there's no hierarchy present. There's no predetermined pathway for desire to follow along for the child. The child is like, it's almost like it's in the germinal phase, where like these drives and things of that nature, sexuality, haven't really like solidified themselves in the way. And like, if you're thinking about this in terms of like literal differentiation, the way that an embryo begins to grow into a more differentiated being or what have you, right? So that would be kind of like my pushback, because it does kind of follow logically that there would be, you know what I mean? If you're kind of starting with these primordial sort of drives or what have you in the infant, that this is where the leaning on concept makes sense with respect to Freud, right? Because it does kind of make sense that like, if whenever desire is more like it's in that zero state, it's in that like it's in that virtual state, perhaps might be the way to really articulate better. So like those channels of directing the organs towards specific functions haven't been acquired yet. So it kind of makes sense that in this undifferentiated flow, that these different types of, well, I guess that would also be another argument we can have too about, is like libidinally, is it all, could it just be psychical energy rather than, placing this language of like libido into this discussion, which I think is another very interesting little way to look at it. If you're thinking in the context of like, if everything is sexual, then nothing is sexual.
Yes, and Laplanche says that directly,
which is kind of the Lacanian, I think, logic showing itself for him, right?
Right, and I think that's part of Jung's pushback against Freud, right, where he wants to try to find room for a psychical energy that would not be inherently sexual. And Laplanche does say what you just mentioned, where if everything is sexual, then nothing is sexual. And I think that he also is suggesting that it's a misreading of Freud, that everything, even in the infant or the child, the young child, that everything would be sexual. I think that Laplanche wants to keep us from from thinking that Freud wants to sexualize everything, even if that might be the accent he places, because he's interested in, I think for him, his conviction is not necessarily that sexual, right? Which would, as you said, as Laplanche says, that would kind of botch everything. I think it's the fact that the accent that Freud keeps coming back to is that the development of pathological symptoms for Freud, the key to unlocking, if you will, the matrix for understanding those pathological symptoms has to be traced back to a sexual origin. I think that's kind of Freud's conviction.
Right.
And whether or not, now, obviously, that too could be pushed back against, but I do think that we might be too quick to misread Freud and think that he sexualizes everything, or he believes sexuality can be found everywhere. Deleuze do something similar too. As you realize that, like for them, there is a way in which sexuality is played out on various levels. I don't know I think they say it can be found everywhere, even if they don't reduce everything to the sexual. But they also want to push back at concepts like sublimation. So even with Freud, they think that why is it that Freud gives in to the idea, maybe influenced by Jung, that sexuality, in order to invest, or desire to invest the social field, has to be sublimated and it has to be desexualized. I think that that's where they kind of say, like, Freud gives up one of his one of the convictions he has and dilutes it. But in any case, that I know we're going astray, which is technically the title of this book in French, Fourvoiement, is literally a straying or going astray, a wandering off the path. I know that the title of the book in English is Temptation of Biology, but anyway, I'll pause because I had a couple of other responses to the stuff you said, but I don't want to, we can maybe pick out one of those threads and focus on it. You mentioned polymorphous perversity. You mentioned the sort of biologization of the drives that, or sexuality that Laplanche is interested in qualifying. There's a couple other things you mentioned that we could focus on as well, with your notion of an energy that would not necessarily be libidinal. Obviously, Deleuze and Guattari multiply libido by talking about Newman and voluptas, right? So, although it's not necessarily that all three of those energies aren't sexual, but I'll pause for a second just to let you respond.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of anticipated where I was going to go with respect to the critique of sublimation, and that desire is already suffused, or what have you, is already dispersed in everything, in the social already.
Yeah.
Which I think, I mean, that point is where Laplanche and Deleuze and Guattari sound quite close together, right? Because if the seduction theory that he presents is right, then that certainly follows, right? If the child's like, because he gets into the idea that there's these unconscious messages that the caregivers are not aware of per se, but in their actions, I think it kind of makes sense to see how this could become a type of message to the child with respect to the care that the caregiver takes whenever wiping the baby's ass or cleaning its vagina.
Right. That's a good
penis,
that's a
right?
good example.
The way that the parent or caregiver, to be broader, the unconscious, even their probably like their facial expressions, etc., like all of these things are being communicated to the child. The child really doesn't have a vocabulary to translate, to use the word Laplanche does, translation.
Yes, that's right.
Specifically, the child's mind is not developed enough to be able to process these enigmatic signifiers.
That's right.
As he refers to them, that are getting communicated when it comes to, I think he says potty training is one, obviously the classic psychoanalytic example of the breast.
Yeah.
And I think to really highlight where he's talking about with the breast, even, it's like, you might often see someone that's breastfeeding would cover the baby with a blanket, or like, you know what I mean? So even in those types of maybe seemingly banal behaviors, there's something is being communicated to the child that sort of marks this as something, I don't know, necessarily to be a it marks it with something, right? It says something. It
It's a
communicates.
kind of intimacy. I mean, the word that Freud uses is tenderness. There's something that is meant to be private, obviously, to the fact that breasts are meant to be, or at least for the most part, conventionally, socially, in the accepted way, meant to be covered. Yeah. So yeah. One thing I did want to pick out, and maybe this can orient the discussion a little bit, is Laplanche. And it's interesting that the title is provocative, The Temptation of Biology, because he will say pretty quickly outright that it's not to deny biology's role in whether it be sexuality or the drives, because it's very obvious that that bodies are involved, right? Corporeality is involved. So it's not so much as biology itself, insofar as it's either a domain, a field of individuating forces, or in the sense in which it's a study of those fields. So it's not. It's actually kind of a provocative and maybe a purposely misleading, because he says pretty quickly, it's not about the biologization or it's really more what we might call a crude biologization. But what he says, it's against the path certain psychoanalysts have taken. Strachey is to blame for this as a translator of Freud into English, of the instinctualization of sexuality, or of psychoanalysis in particular. So that's, I think, why he begins his lectures. And these lectures, by the way, for the listener, that we're looking at, date from the 91 and 92. What Laplanche is pushing back against is the way in which the ethological notion of instinct is used sort of heavy-handedly to explain humans and their development psychically, sexually, because I think for him, and he makes this pretty clear, and Freud's pretty clear about it too, it's not, even Freud leaves the question open. It's not quite clear that humans have instinct in the way that we see it in other animals. And we've talked about this too, Coop, like the example Laplanche gives, Freud gives, the bird, the baby bird at the edge of the tree, of the tree limb, right near the nest, has a kind of instinctual, which means inherited, hereditary, sort of free formed blueprint for orienting itself in the world, right? Including things like orienting towards food sources, towards nest building, towards mating rituals, even something, although this is a little bit more complex, a predisposition, if you will, for developing certain songs. Now we know that by experiment that songs are more complex, and in fact, it's not fully innate or fully acquired. So there's a bit of a breakdown in that binary, which is fine, and it needs to be, right. But in any case, I think that for Freud, he's himself wary of thinking about an instinct that would be a kind of pre-given thing in the human, which is why tree shouldn't be translated that way, right? As instinct, right? Why drive it works, why the French use the word pulsion, because that also kind of brings to mind what tree is, right? It is a kind of driving. Obviously, instinct from the Latin etymologically means something like that, something that is pushed or driven. It's just that it has taken on a certain valence in the scientific literature that makes it easily confused, and therefore a word that should not be used. And so I think that for Laplanche, there's nothing instinctual about sexuality. In fact, he will make a move that's kind of interesting, where he will say, based on his model, as you laid out, and as I also laid out, based on the model of the way in which the other person, the adult other, implants unconsciously these unconscious enigmatic signifiers that have sexual messages, etc., into the child unwittingly. For Laplanche, if we take that seriously, then that would be what we might call instinct, and therefore instinct would not be primordial and drives develop afterwards, but the reverse. there's a kind of interesting way in which Laplanche is going to force us into these seeming paradoxes where it's always going to be counterintuitive to our common sense, right? We might think instinct would be something pre-given and just taken as a baseline and be primordial. I think the way that Laplanche shows that there's a twisted, strange temporality that we have to, if we're going to use these terms, which I think he doesn't necessarily want to, but if we were to, for him, instinctual sexuality, if we can even call it that, and its functionality would be secondary to the polymorphous perversity that you brought up, Coop.
Yeah, God, there's so much. Trying to think where to interject here. Yeah, there's a kind of like, he brings up Neutroglycite here as well, because it shares a certain like similarity to what he refer to it as kind of like this pseudo concept. That's not, I don't think he says pseudo specifically, Barthes.
He calls it a pseudo concept or a paraconcept.
Yeah.
It's not something that Freud himself really seizes upon. And I think that he's like, it took Freud to be translated in this example into French because Lacan will claim right out that he's responsible for isolating Neutroglycite as a concept, right?
Yeah.
The retroactive action, or the deferred action is one way it's translated. In French, it's translated as après coup, which is literally like the after the fact. Or it's like an aftermath or an after event, right?
Because, oh man, I wish I could remember the line, but there's a specific line where he really articulates perfectly how this, like the seduction. I don't know how to explain. I'd have to pull up the goddamn thing, so I might have to edit this out. But just kind of I just wanted to maybe dig into a little bit more specifically this example he gives with respect to seduction and the sexual sort of, like, there's that weird retroactivity, and you said specifically, right, it doesn't make sense to us from a common sense point of view with respect to sexual desire, right? Because it's like it's not pre-established, but it is.
I think for Laplanche, yes, sexuality, and I think that for him, it would be a question if that term can even apply to a simple biological orientation. I think that for Laplanche, there's going to be something that breaks down our categories of innate and acquired, not just for instinct, but even for sexuality, right? I think that that's going to be the path, the winding, spiraling path that he's trying to isolate.
Yeah.
And so no, I think that Laplanche, and this is part of the temptation of biology, is really what he's talking about is a kind of crude biologism where we would have very strict divisions between a nature nurture, he doesn't use those terms, but
Yeah.
an innate acquired. I don't think he even uses those terms in this text, at least. But you can see that that's what's in play, right? That these crude binaries are being called into question by Laplanche. And you're right to bring out Neutroglycite at the aftermath or after effect or deferred action, blah, blah, blah. I mentioned those. I'm trying to look for the page where he brings it out because I do think it's important.
This is interesting, I think, to look at Deleuze's kind of like articulation of maybe like the differential in the unconscious, and I think maybe even admixtures to an extent, right? Because it's like there is like any of these factors, like the social factor, the let's maybe put innate biological factors in scare quotes just for convenience sake, but like these things can, like, these are variables that are on these different spectrums, and they really, how they like through interaction, through moving and motion and relation to other beings, right, is where they get expressed. And the way that they are expressed is not predetermined per se in that sense, but like, so that's why there's so much variation, because like, yeah, like this little portion, this can have like a 10%, let's say, just to simplify, this variable, let's say, has a 10% influence in one individual versus like 90% in another individual, but that's only half sort of the equation. And so then you wind up with a greater field of diversity in the way that these things are expressed in the world, if that makes sense. As far as a differential, right? Because it's like, it's not linear, it's quasi linear in a sense, but it's not fully linear in the way that you would go from Freud's like notion of anal, oral, yada, yada, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that might have been kind of sloppy in terms of what I was trying to say, but I was just trying to say that there's kind of like perhaps like two different planes of influence, and there's a wide spectrum on both planes of influence, and the way that is allocated is not predetermined and only comes into expression through relation with the world and others.
Yeah, I think this is why Laplanche, when he breaks down the four elements of the drive, right? You've got the thrust, aim, object, and source. The source would be the biological, at least very specifically biological, because Freud's always going to want to say that the source is the psychical representative of the drive located in an organ or a biological region, and that's why we can't say a lot about it, right? The aim is always to always discharge, right? Discharge of tension is what he calls satisfaction, right? That's the purpose of the psychical apparatus, is to keep a sort of homeostatic equilibrium for these energies. The object is contingent and could just as well be one's own body, as we see in his discussion of infantile polymorphous perversity. And then pressure is the one thing that's constant, right? And I do think that what's interesting is Laplanche brings out this notion of there's a fifth element that wouldn't necessarily be related to the drive itself, but that is sometimes called the goal. You'll see this language a lot more in Lacanian theory working this out, but it is present in Freud's language, and at least in the Freudian framework, Laplanche is bringing out that the goal, or you might say purpose, would be the threat of the instinctualization of sexuality, right? And what he means by that is that Freud, at least in 1905, when he's working out the three essays on sexuality, there's no real indication that purpose or goal is to be a part of the explanation of sexuality, which means, right, that any teleological explanation that sexuality is for reproducing the species, that's going to be one of the instinctualizations that Laplanche is wanting to call into question and bracket, right? Now, where does goal and purpose come up in Freud's language around this time? It's in the self-preservative, quote unquote, drive or function, as Laplanche tries to suggest. Perhaps self-preservation isn't a drive in the sense in which we think of other drives, right? Maybe it's more of a functional aspect. And therefore, maybe it's more of if we have that small amount of instinctual self-preservative aspect, that's where we can apply goal and purpose. Purpose is to keep the individual living, and then perhaps not just for itself, but to eventually perpetuate the species as well. Now, the tricky thing is, of course, right, there's going to be this dialectic between the self-preservative and the sexual. And that's why Laplanche seizes upon this language of Freud's Anlehnung, which is, I think, Strachey translates it as attachment. And as you know, attachment theory is a whole trend in psychoanalysis. Laplanche is going to seize upon this notion of Anlehnung, which is a pseudo-para concept, as to use the language that he uses, that you brought it out earlier, but that Laplanche wants to really bring out. And so I know that in Life and Death in Psychoanalysis, Jeffrey Melman translated as propping, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but the translation, Macy's translation here, and we see it more frequently in translations of Laplanche, is translated as leaning on. And so maybe we can start there, talk a little bit about, for Laplanche, and this goes to Freud's own definition very clearly, where let me find the strict definition. Quote, "The sexual drives find their first objects by leaning on what is valued by the ego drives, or the self-preservative drives, precisely in the way in which the first sexual satisfaction are experienced, leaning on the bodily functions necessary for the preservation of life. So this is Laplanche quoting Freud here, quoting he's actually quoting on the universal tendency to debasement of the sphere of love. That's interesting. I haven't read that in a while, but in any case, so Laplanche puts forward this Freudian definition of leaning on, with a little bit of bracketing and modifications that he does. But in any case, so the initial model that Freud is proposing is how these sexual drives are leaning on for support the self-preservative drives. Now, before I show or talk about a little bit the way that Laplanche tries to complicate this, it's at least a very striking image, if you will.
I mean, this probably throws your whole schema into disarray, but what I found quite interesting, or something that stands out for me, was that, like, this idea that self-preservation and the sexual are already tied together anyways, but maybe the context is different in the sense of, like, preserving the species, or I'm preserving me. My self-preservation is to mate, is to have offspring so that I continue, and a more, right, and a less direct, but still, like, I think Laplanche even goes to say this about Lacan, kind of has this, or champions this kind of idea of being towards death from Heidegger, which is, like, in my shitty understanding, would be something like an anxiety towards one's own mortality that is perhaps the drive, that's maybe the pressure, so to speak, that gets applied to the being, right? Maybe that being the source of this pressure to move, or yada yada.
I guess I would say here, because I did speak a little bit quickly about how self-preservation is where we find goals. I do think that it's difficult I think Laplanche, and maybe even Freud too, I believe, it doesn't necessarily want to yet inscribe the reproduction of the species into the infant's self-preservation, right? That would be, and I think that's why, Coop, as you brought up earlier about the different stages that Freud later brings in, even if he's not hard and fast with it like Carl Abraham, as Laplanche points out, he still will refer to, you've got the oral stage, and you got the anal stage, and then the phallic, and eventually you got a genital stage, and that's when you have, full-blown reproductive capacities. And now there's a way in which sexuality, due to the play and lure of pleasure, sort of almost is a trick that is inscribed within the individual to perpetuate the species, right? Like, this is Freud's kind of interesting way of conceiving pleasure as a lure to get us to fuck.
Right. Yeah. Or to even eat, right? Like the pleasure that we get, I was interested thinking about this too with respect to, like, the polymorphously perverse, and I think how just broadly deterritorialized human desire would be, at least theoretically, compared to animal desire, is that it's like, if you get the munchies and you're eating Doritos, like, at some point the pleasure becomes less about the flavor and yada yada, but it's like the repetition of the crunchiness, like the what I mean, like, one can get in this, like, to where, yeah, it's totally detached from hunger, and it's more like I'm well past, like, satiety, but I'm still eating just because there's this pressure that is disassociated from my biology. And it's like this psychical pressure to continue this behavior beyond its, like, one would say maybe, like, its logical conclusion, like its logical quote unquote aim, right?
Yeah. So I guess, at least when we consider the polymorphous perversity of the infant, it's very clear, right, that means that that sexuality is by no means located in the genitals, right? If that
has to be learned, which that makes sense, right? Like, that makes complete sense.
There's almost an overcoating of the body onto the. Obviously, this is not 100% true, but this is a tendency, let's say, right, to concentrate sexuality around the genitals, and that comes much later in the development of the adult. But in this initial stage, or in these initial stages, and they're not even stages, we could say phases. Maybe that's a better word. Language here is tricky. But if there is a leaning of sexuality on the self-preservative, and then there's a kind of parting of ways after the fact in the maturation of the child into an adult, Laplanche wants to say, well, that's the funny thing, because if self-preservation can be said to be something perhaps ingrained in human beings, even in the most feeble of ways, which we might locate in the drive for hunger or need for thirst, etc. Laplanche wants to say, well, is it really the case that sexuality is there from the start? I think for Laplanche, what he's trying to get at in these lectures and running through these concepts and whatnot is that, in fact, from the start, sexuality has to be implanted, as we were saying, by the adult other. And that's only then do we have a kind of dialectic, a leaning on that could be possible.
I mean, do you think really what he's getting at is, well, a kind of move towards like desiring product or machinic desire, right? Or am I, what do you think about that?
If it makes sense that if we were to translate and say that sexuality or the sexual, you're using the word desire, that's always Deleuze and Guattari's term, is engineered. I mean, I think that for him, because with Deleuze and Guattari, it's they're not necessarily from the start, at least, and even throughout, they're not necessarily interested in this notion of the adult other embedding. They're not interested in that movement. It's not their problem. I think the Laplanche, because he's trying to do a kind of reading of Freud that isn't just an exegesis and isn't just a hermeneutics of his text, but a real problematizing of Freud's movements, his developments and his movements and his going off course, as he wants to call it, right? Because Freud is trying to understand the unconscious for a clinical reason for the development of psychoanalysis. And I think that Laplanche is trying to say Freud is I don't think he wants to use the word hesitating, but yeah, sure, he's going down a path, seeing what that where that path takes him, and sometimes tracking back or going or taking detours in different manners. And Laplanche is really trying to bring out these detours that Freud is taking and see what can be like the detour of giving up the seduction theory. That for Laplanche, it's the meme of the two men digging with their pickaxe, and you get right up to the mother lode and turn back. Whereas if you'd have kept going another 10 feet, you get the prize. I think that Laplanche maybe is almost memeing in that way, except it's not a straight line that Freud needed to take. Actually, there's a kind of way in which the whole notion of seduction needed to be folded in on itself and invaginated, so to speak, right? Because it's not oriented in the right way. It's oriented in a way that thinks is causally oriented in quote unquote reality. And so, yeah, I guess with your question of sure, I would say Laplanche might agree that yes, desire is machined, engineered, produced, but it's through this dialectic coming from the other, right? There's a kind of at least in the initial formations and embedding of these enigmatic signifiers, it's a unilateral directionality where the adult other is engineering desire. So so if we want to try to use those Deleuze and Guattarian terms, I think that Laplanche is trying to say, okay, so it's almost like the theological question, all right, like who made God or whatever. And of course, you could answer God is self-caused. That's Spinoza's way of doing with it, because that's not a problem for him. I think that for Laplanche, he's interested in desire produces what produces desire, right? It's not a problem for Deleuze and Guattari. I think that for Laplanche in this psychoanalytic setting, I think that it is a problem for him, and it helps to orient the analysis and yeah. So I guess I would leave it at that. Maybe that was crude, but I think that there's something of a kernel of why Laplanche is asking different questions than Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm just latching too much or placing too much emphasis on this idea of Oedipus beginning in the mind of the father.
But no, I don't think that's a bad thing to say at all. I think that for Deleuze and Guattari,
Because I mean, that is a type of that is, although I mean, it is a kind of right. It is sexual, certainly. As far as like, this is the repression, this is the social repression, this is where repression comes in the unconscious ways that the father acts towards the child.
Yeah.
In the same similar way, like there can be, I'm sure there, you could see how structurally these kind of like ambiguous signals that the father gives off towards the child, because there's a sort of competition, I suppose, for the mother's attention and affection or what have you.
Right. And we looked at something like this with Girard, who really tries to frame it that way. But even in the sort of threats of punishment, Freud might say castration, right? In the anal stage of taking care of one's own.
I'm going to cut your little pecker
organs.
Off if you do that again. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I think that what's interesting, if Deleuze and Guattari are saying Oedipus begins in the mind of the father, their analysis is orienting. Okay, so is Oedipus is let's say the desire for incest, if we take that as a given, which they don't, but they're saying let's give Freud his due in Totem and Taboo, for example, when Freud deduces from the fact that incest is prohibited that it was therefore desired. It was the thing that was intensely desired. Deleuze and Guattari do call that a question, but then they're saying, okay, so what if that's true? Then that would mean that Oedipus begins in the son or the child, and Oedipus would be a neurotic outgrowth. But their way of shifting it is saying, no, Oedipus actually begins in the mind of the father. It's actually the product of psychosis, of paranoia. Really, it's a paranoid ideation and not a neurotic ideation.
Yeah.
So that's so they shift the model instead of it being, and this goes.
Oh,
to
that's a
their
good
point.
distinction. I like where you're headed. Nice.
Yeah, but this goes to their point about how incest, therefore concluding that incest is desired from the part of the child as a neurotic outgrowth, doesn't make as much sense as thinking as Oedipus as the paranoid ideations of the father, worried about his impotence or worried about being overthrown. I mean, the Oedipus myth mirrors the myths of the birth of Zeus, right? And Kronos being told again, just like Laius was told by an oracle. There's an oracle that predicts that Cronus is going to be overthrown by one of his children, which is why he swallows Poseidon and Hades. Rhea tricks him, and with the third birth, Zeus eventually does overthrow him. You've got the imagery of castration, right? Zeus castrates Kronos, throws his testicles into the ocean. Out of the foam arises Aphrodite, symbolic of obviously love, right? Which is kind of an interesting birth of Eros from that, because Eros will be her child, right? But in any case, but I think Laplanche is saying, if he would agree with Deleuze and Guattari, that Oedipus begins in the mind of the father, his analysis is obviously what we've been sketching out, where it's obviously sexuality, the unconscious, all that machinery that can mobilize and is mobilizing those signifiers unconsciously. That begins in the mind of the adult. That begins in the psycho libidinal purview of the adult, and so we can't, like the Kleinians, that's one of his targets. But even a certain Freud, at certain times when he's vacillating, we can't locate sexuality endogenously in the child. It actually is exogenous. It comes from outside. It comes from the caregiver, the adult in these caregiving activities. And I think that's how Laplanche would read that statement, even if he might not disagree with what Deleuze and Guattari are saying about Oedipus. He would add his 2 cents in and say, yeah, I agree. Yeah, sexuality starts in the adult other and not in the child, as though it were self-caused at birth or something, right? Hopefully that made sense. That Yeah.
Little bit of a detour, but would you say that like for Deleuze and Guattari, the paranoid psychotic aspect of Oedipus beginning in the mind of the father is part of like why Oedipus is this kind of like micro-fascistic, I don't know how to what the what the noun would be there, but do you see what I'm saying? Versus like the neuroses or the neurotic for Freud.
Well, it's you know, it's interesting because I think if we follow Laplanche along, Oedipus begins in the mind of the father as a paranoid ideation, but two, we also know that very quickly the child entering into language acquisition, which is what Lacan associates with castration, rather than threatening the bodily potency in the male organ or whatever, right? Lacan gets rid of that biologizing tendency. Maybe that's another tendency or temptation of biology in Freud is to think castration literally, again, kind of like he thought of seduction literally. So yes, it begins in the mind of the father or of the caregiver, to use Laplanche's language, but it's also implanted in the child, which means that the superego's injunction, if it does lead to neurosis, its basis is paranoid. It is an implantation of a kind of paranoia that perhaps, at least initially, cannot be interpreted, quote unquote, by means of the child's meager faculties, which is not just an intellectual question. Sure, that's part of it, right? It's also just the fact of the lack of knowledge of sexuality. That knowledge only slowly really starts to accumulate after the latency period, after puberty, and even then still can take a certain amount of development emotionally, socially, right? I mean, all these various intelligence rather than it being something about being smart, obviously, right?
Yeah, I don't know how much else I had to
Well,
go
let's
over,
see.
to be honest.
I would say maybe I'm trying to think of anything else to bring out. We've actually covered a decent amount of ground, and I'm glad you brought up the Deleuze and Guattari stuff. I hadn't really been honestly thinking about it very much myself. So
I
that
mean,
was a good.
I wondered, like, I mean, this is a bit, I'm going to go take a leap perhaps, but like, I mean, I'm thinking about the recording surface and inscription as far as it relates to seduction, because that's what Laplanche seems to suggest that it's not just repression. There's other aspects to what creates the drives. I mean, that's actually a good place to go, I think, is his analysis of the drives and how they are initiated, right? Because it's not about it's the mistranslation of the sexual desire of the caregiver that gives rise to the drives,
Mm-hmm.
for Laplanche at least.
Yes, this is one of Freud's interesting. I mean, one of the ways he brings up the different types of object love, right? The narcissistic type, right, where we take ourselves as the model of later in life of what we would like to love, and as Freud makes it, it's not just ourselves as who we were, right, as children, or who we are now, or who we will be, but also who we would like to be, right, or at least a part of ourselves, right. So that's one type of object choice, one type of orientation of our sexual desire. But the other part would be this is the other way she uses Anlehnung's, where he goes back to leaning on, where we choose an object choice based on, this is what Strachey calls analytic object choice, based on those who cared for us. Now, that's usually what we think of when we think about Oedipus, right? We think about how Oedipus is always an analytic, quote unquote. It always leans on specifically, right, the mother in the classical example, right? You desire your mother, you want to kill your father, etc. Right? Rather than desiring someone like yourself, that would be the narcissistic type in all its variations. So this question of sort of object choice is interesting because we do know that object is one of the elements of a drive that the drive to fulfill its aim of satisfaction, right, of the release of tension, needs an object. But the object can be anything. It's contingent, but it's that through which it aims. And I think for Freud in the On Narcissism essay, he's bringing out these two different types of object for us to look at. whether it be the narcissistic object choice, which of course goes back to his whole theories about childhood sexuality and it being autoerotic, right? More or less taking its own body or regions of its body, and the polymorphous perversity that we brought up earlier as the sort of model or framework. But then, of course, there's the Anlehnung's analytic type, where as our model, it's our caregivers. It's the other adult that implanted sexuality into us psychically, which is why I think, like the stuff we did on Girard, where he's calling into question Oedipus and its logic. It seems to be taken for a given, so to speak, that the mother for the little boy is going to be the primary object choice. The difficult thing, and even like distinguishing, there's a point, and Laplanche doesn't, he only like hints at this, but like there's a way in which even in the On Narcissism essay, Freud is almost converging the narcissistic object choice and the anaclitic, because if you remember, Coop, we talked about this in our discussion of the narcissism essay, which listeners can find on our YouTube or on our SoundCloud. One of the things that Freud mentions is he kind of has a little bit of misogyny here. I won't cover over it. I'm going to bring it out at front, but where he says like the beautiful woman who has never really had the chance to love anyone else more than she's loved herself until she has a child, right? Specifically like a little baby boy, I think is what he says. I'm trying to remember if he sexualizes or genders the child. But he's like, it's only when she has a child that now she can love something or someone more than or as much as herself. But Freud really, the twist is, of course, that it's precisely because this is a narcissistic relation, right? That the child is a part of her. So already right there's a blending, if you will, or a kind of convergence of the anaclitic and the narcissistic, because if for the mother, the child is a kind of itself implied by Freud as a narcissistic love object. Here, love taking in a very broad sense, not in the sense in which maybe Freud is strictly thinking about sexuality. Then I think we already see the kind of interesting interplay between the anaclitic and the narcissistic, where the mother is loving the child, caregiving, caressing, tender love, etc., because of her own narcissism for herself. And that narcissism interplays with what will be the leaning on of sexuality, on the self-preservative, etc. So you see how there's a kind of spiraling and dialectic even between those two, that binary of object choice.
Yeah, I don't know if I had much else.
Okay. Gosh, I would. I guess. Yeah. I mean, we can keep this episode short.
Yeah. Trying to think, like the only other even remote points I had were like, I don't know, I thought it was interesting, like the polymorphous perversity of the infant or what have you. Like, I think you can kind of like maybe take some of the empirical expression of how human sexuality over time has sort of rings true, that there's not like that polymorphous perversity is like has salience because of the way that it has been, like sexuality has been expressed over the history of humanity, right? Because you have things like findoms, right? Like financial domination, where rich men will typically, at least, will basically blow money on their typically a woman, oftentimes younger, that kind of like insults them and like degrades them, but they give money to that person despite this sort of. So you can kind of see, like in that example, clearly how sexual desire is not really tied to necessarily to organ pleasure directly, right? Like it's a lot more deterritorialized and open than that. And that's perhaps why, like, the anxiety of the sexual, the nature, the deterritorialized nature of libido itself is what demands these repressive structures like the family or Oedipus or what have you, right? Because we can't have our flows just going willy-nilly, man. We can't allow that, right? We can't have people shitting, pissing, and coming where they want to, right? We have to have order in Gotham.
That's pretty funny. Yeah. Well, that's also what we discussed in our anti-Oedipus read through when we talked about the disinvestment of the organs, or the privatization of the organs, right? Specifically the privatization of the anus. And so that kind of, obviously I won't delve too much into that here, but that dovetails with sort of what you were suggesting. This way in which there's an isolating of these bodily functions for, we could say, for hygiene, but also for superstitious types of cultural values relating to women and needing to be isolated during their menstrual periods because of whether it be the aura or the sort of energy that might contaminate, other parts of the social field.
I mean, it's even perhaps goes to something like Alenka Zupancic with What is Sex? Or like Lacan's general kind of notion of sex as this something that can't be signified, or there is no sexual relation. Maybe to put a finer point on that is like, there is no a priori way that sex or even reproduction has to occur. I've said this a number of times, like, we don't even have to have penetrative sex, even before like the modern IVF sort of technology. Like, the principle remains the same as far as like, if we can get the semen inside the vagina and by some means, we can achieve the same end. And so the pathway to that point is really sort of irrelevant. There's no
reason to even stop there, right, Coop? I mean, you can imagine, as you know, obviously the reproduction without the need for biological uteruses, right? So we can easily imagine a future in which labor, not just work, but labor in the sense of childbirth, will be not offloaded onto technological
which really does free
innovations.
Women, right? It kind of frees women from this, like, at least culturally this cultural imperative that a woman's function is merely to reproduce.
And and so it would definitely, that type of development would require or would instigate a dialectical transformation of norms and values, right? This kind of gets to something Simondon put forward pretty strongly, pretty clearly, right? That technical development has to go hand in hand with a social evolution of, that's not the right word, but what we might call progress, right? There would have to be a development of a transformation of social collective values and norms. And I think that's his point being, if either of these two are out of step, they hinder and prohibit or disrupt one another, right? If the technical progress outstrips the social, there's a way in which that becomes a barrier to further technical progress, and I think vice versa, right? There's
like in Blade Runner, right? Because there's this animosity, or there's like a speciesism against the replicants, right? They call them like skin job. I forget what they call them in 2049. I don't know if there was a different epithet or if I can't remember if they use skin job or whatever, but there was obviously, like, Kay's character would get insulted or
in the Matrix, the humans are called copper tops, right? Or the ones that aren't sort of freed from their little feeding, their little encasements by they're called copper tops, or even the Butlerian jihad. I think is easy to show that there's an out of step. There's a way in which the values and norms of a certain society was not in rhythm with the technical progress that unleashed unintended consequences, which is why there was a pushback and overthrow of calculating machines of all kinds, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about that in the context of, like, what was I going to go with that? It was like, I guess the narcissistic mother, or like this self-preservation, or like this example of the narcissistic mother in the sense of humanity as, like, right? It's like, it's because of this kind of like Oedipal thing, this Oedipal fucking paranoia, right? About being usurped by our children, the artificial, quote unquote, you know what I mean?
Yeah, our children, and
which could go to X-Men too, right? Like the mutants, there's a similar thing too. It's right, like
the threat,
the threat that's closer than the enemy or something like that. The enemy within, sort of idea.
And you remember from the Symposium, which Aristophanes' myth, which Freud talks about, which Laplanche brings up, and the different readings that Freud gives that are more or less drawing opposite conclusions from them. The whole reason for dividing the primordial human, happy in its duplicity, right, is because Zeus was afraid of their power. There's something even in Genesis where obviously Spinoza gives the reading that God isn't commanding us not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil because of some moral damnation that's being threatened to us, but the fact that this fruit would be harmful to the composition of our forces, our relational forces. But the Genesis story hints at this idea that humans would become too powerful with access to the trees, right? Whether it be the knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of life, which Henri Atlan himself says it's one and the same tree. But in any case, this notion of a feeling of impotence drives the Oedipus myth. These other stories that we're talking about, the Kronos myth. All of this is, and then you could find it in Freud's story about the primordial father, right? Why does the primordial father hoard and exile, hoard the women and exile the sons, right? Fear of impotence and being overthrown. So much for paranoia, right? I mean, that's. But yeah, we talked a little bit more, and we're able to take our own going astray from the material. But it's always nice to throw in a little cultural references there.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up there for this week's discussion on the machinic unconscious happy hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.